Now, joining us now, we have Tinashe Chuchu, a lecturer from Wits University. Tinashe, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Now, you've been following the U.S. presidency for a long time.
Yes.
We won't say how long, but I know it's a very long time. Now, Barack Obama's inauguration was a historic moment for Americans.
Yes.
Do you think his presidency has lived up to the hopes of the people of America? Well, the ones that voted for him.
I think to a certain extent it has lived up to their hopes, but Obama's legacy is actually dependent on who's telling the story. For instance, if you look at what Republicans are saying right now, there are some Senate hearings. They'll say he's significant because he was the first African American. They don't say he's significant because he was able to pass the Affordable Health Care Act, which is known as Obamacare. Since Lyndon Johnson, Democrats have been trying to pass universal health care. So I think that was his signature achievement, but he also signed the Lilly Ledbetter Fair Act. It was an act designed to help especially women in terms of getting fair pay in the workplace. He also was instrumental with Don't Ask, Don't Tell Act, when service troops were allowed to serve in the army, but they were actually not allowed to disclose their sexual orientation. So I think he did a lot, but it also depends who's saying the story. And in terms of employment, I think he did try to put that in play. In terms of saving the auto industry, he saved Chrysler, GM, Ford. So I think his legacy is not only going to be the first black president, but he's a president who actually got 20 million people, 20 million Americans covered by the Obamacare Act.
Now, before we unpack some of his achievements and maybe some of the lows of his presidency, let's compare his presidency with his predecessor, George W. Bush. How do we compare the two? Can we even compare the two?
I think you can compare the two. In terms of comparing President Obama to President Bush, I could say that he helped repair the image, the country's image. For instance, after the Iraq War, Bush sort of helped damage the U.S. reputation, and Obama tried to heal some of that by pulling out troops from Iraq. And he actually wanted to close Guantanamo Bay, but we all know that never happened. So I think you can compare them in terms of their foreign policy. Obama did try to open up opportunities for immigrants to come in, even though they say that he's weakening the borders. But I think you can compare him in terms of foreign policy to George Bush.
Now, let's look at the race relations in America. I mean, that's something we can't ignore. We saw last year and even the year before, the Black Lives Matter hashtag was huge. It was everywhere on social media, and the whole world was speaking about it. You have a lot of people who come and say Barack wasn't strong in his stance when it came to race relations. Is that a fair statement, or is there more to it than that?
I think he was caught in the middle. You're the first black president, and you don't want people to think that you are a president only for black people. So I personally think that the Clintons did more for African Americans, but with Obama, I think it was sort of uncomfortable for him to, let's say, to nominate a black cabinet or to nominate a black Secretary of State. I think he did try to be fair, but I still think the Clintons did more. And he said himself, historians will judge me. He didn't want to say how he thinks he could rate himself. But I think in terms of race, he did try.
Speaking of historians judging him, would you say that for the most part, it's a case of, you know, the black majority, well, in the United States saying that you actually didn't do much for us based on the race relation issue there?
Yes, yes. I think a lot of African Americans also then said they felt sort of left out with the Trayvon Martin shooting. They felt that having a black president in the White House, maybe you could have used his influence to change the outcome. And that was a tough pill to swallow for a lot of African Americans. So some of them still feel that he didn't do enough for them.
Now,
Yes.
you mentioned the Clintons, and I just want to
Yes.
go there before we move forward. I mean, we saw how Hillary Clinton lost to
Yes.
Donald Trump. And speaking of, what they did for black people when Bill Clinton was president, as well as the message that Hillary Clinton was pushing. I mean, she was speaking to women, she was speaking to black Americans, and she was also speaking, to the Latin American community, a more diverse group. Why didn't that speak to Americans then?
Okay, actually, it's interesting you said that. What happened was, like in America, they elect their presidents due to electoral college vote.
Yes.
Hillary Clinton, I think the whole world now knows she had 2.5 million more votes. But what then happened was she spoke to a lot of people, but she spoke to people in states that didn't matter because she had 10 million votes that didn't count. She had a lot of votes in Texas due to the Hispanic vote, a lot of votes in California, a state she won, but she didn't win the critical votes in the swing states. So I think she spoke to America, but she didn't speak to the right America because her message of clean energy didn't speak to the co-worker who lost his job or the steel worker who lost his job in Ohio. Yeah.
So let's go back to
Yes.
Obama now. I mean, we saw how
Yes.
he won in 2008, and then fast forward to him winning his second term. What do you think the difference was there? Because I think in terms of the second term, him winning that one, it was touch and go. There he wasn't maybe as confident as he
Yeah.
was the first time around. What do you think changed in that first period?
I think what then happened was, to be honest, anyone would tell you that the Clinton loss was actually a huge shock because in terms of demographics, they were actually in her favor. The country is now so diverse. But what then happened was, if you look back at 2012, Romney didn't necessarily lose because Obama was a lot stronger. He actually lost because Republicans stayed at home. And these same Republicans just voted, and no one thought that Pennsylvania would go red, because in 1988, that's the last time a Republican had won the state. So I think what then happened was, in 2012, a lot of white Americans in the rural areas felt that Romney was an elitist. He doesn't speak to us, so they just sat home. And at the same time, 6 million Democrats sat home this year because they felt that if Obama couldn't create jobs for us, maybe Clinton wouldn't, because it was hard for her to separate herself from her old boss.
It's actually interesting that you speak of jobs, because other analysts will come and say the reason why Republicans voted, or Americans voted the way they voted for Donald Trump, is because some of the radical policies that he speaks of or that he's going to implement are conversations that they have at dinner tables. They don't necessarily maybe make it public, but those are the things that they sit down and say, actually, we want that wall to be built, or do you know what I mean? And we want to deport people, and that's why he won. Would you say that's accurate?
I know that's on point. That's accurate, because I was following all the debates, and you'd find that I could predict what any candidate would say. But with him, he actually spoke like a regular person. It's no secret that the Muslim ban, people thought about it. A lot of people thought about the Muslim ban, but it was politically uncomfortable or incorrect to say that. And he said that. And I think that it's unfortunate the country is now so divided, because if you win the electoral college but you lose the popular vote, it's not a comfortable win. But I think what you're saying is true. These were dinner table conversations.
Now, let's look at the final speech that Obama will be giving at around 4 a.m. Our local time. What can we expect from it? I mean, he mentioned a few things, but what do you think his overall message to the people of America, to the people of the world, will be in general?
Okay. I think it's going to be a hard speech for Obama, because I don't think this is the way he wanted to exit. Yeah. And a lot of the energy from having the first black president, having Obama, was taken out by the Clinton loss. But I think he's going to try to have a unifying message to say, we might not agree with what Trump says, or we might not agree with what he stands for, but we can all agree that we respect the Constitution. So let's give him a chance to succeed, because if he succeeds, the country succeeds. And at the same time, I think that's what also negatively affected Obama because he was receiving so much resistance from a Republican Congress. So I think it's going to be sort of positive in the sense that he's probably not going to attack Trump because it won't serve anyone's best interest by attacking him.
The whole world is waiting with bated breath to hear what Barack Obama has to say in his final address as the President of the United States of America. And because of that, we are still joined by Tinashe Chuchu, a lecturer at Wits University, unpacking for us Obama's legacy as America counts down to his final address as the President of the USA. Thanks for joining me again.
Thank you for having me back.
Now, let's look at foreign policy.
Yes.
We spoke about it a little bit earlier on briefly, but the nuclear peace deal, for example, we saw that being, a lot of people being worried about it, you know, when Trump, for example, was elected late last year. What can we expect to happen in that regard? And maybe we can then backtrack and look at how that came about.
Okay. I think Trump supporters might be actually shocked by how he's going to react to intelligence briefing regarding the nuclear deal, because what I've noticed is a lot of candidates, they promise a lot, and once they sit in the Oval Office, they actually discover that it's not as easy as they thought. So the nuclear deal, it actually affects 7 other countries. It's something that took years to put in place. So I don't think it's something that he can just rip off on his first day. And at the same time, I don't think Iran is a country that you can just say, we have an agreement with you and we can just drop that agreement, because the consequences can be catastrophic. So I think he might not actually rip it off. That's what I think.
Now, perhaps a shocking statistic would be that America's spending on defense during Obama's tenure, for example, is said to be the highest since World War II. Did America make any strides in the war against terror, considering how much they spent?
I think they did try to make some inroads, in the sense that when they were using drones, they took out a lot of these top ISIS leaders, and at the same time, it was difficult to win a war when you are using drones and you actually need boots on the ground. So I think Obama did try, but they still needed boots on the ground, and drones, let's say $10 million US for one drone. That's why also the budget would be 500 billion a year.
Now let's look at something that we definitely care about, and that's his African heritage.
Yes.
Do you think it influenced how the USA interacted with the African continent during his tenure?
Strange enough, that actually never happened. Someone said that people shouldn't forget that he's a US president.
Not an African president.
Not an African president. Yeah. And even though he has roots in Kenya, he barely lived in Kenya. And, but I think in terms of giving Africans hope, African Americans hope, I think he has a place in history. But to actually say that more Africans got opportunities in America or more business deals were done, we would be lying if we say that it really happened.
Does it then go back to that thing where he continuously felt stuck? So in America, for example, between with all the race relations, he felt like, yes, I'm a black president, but I'm a president for all Americans. And once again, even with Africa, he couldn't just pump, you know, maybe ridiculous amounts of money here just because he's African. True,
true. And in terms of even credibility, that's how people lose their credibility. And just right now, there are a lot of potential conflicts of interest with Trump's businesses and his appointments. So I think Obama probably wanted to do more for Africa because he was the first US president to speak at the AU. He has visited Senegal, South Africa so many times. He has tried to bridge the gap with Africa. But to say that he did significant inroads, I would be lying. That's why I went to the Clintons, who created so many opportunities in Africa.
Let's look at something that he mentioned a little earlier on in the clip that we saw about, you know, mending fences with Cuba. Is there an indication of this relationship continuing past his administration, or will it be a wait-and-see game considering that Trump is coming in?
I think this is going to be quite interesting because we could say that Trump was saying in most of his speeches that we seem to lose so much with these trade deals, and I know his supporters would want him to close that Cuban embassy and go back to the pre-US-Cuba relations that Obama is trying to set up. I don't necessarily see him closing that embassy, but maybe he might not be a fan of removing the trade embargo. I think that trade embargo is going to last for a very long time because he now has the Congress. He's going to appoint a Supreme Court judge. He has the White House. I don't see that trade embargo going, and the Cubans will only feel relief when that trade embargo is lifted. But I don't see him closing that embassy.
Now, in terms of the US's foreign policy overall, can we expect a complete deviation from what Obama was trying to achieve with this new administration coming in?
Okay. I think in terms of foreign policy, what we might see is a change between Mexico-US relations. And at the moment, a lot of businesses were moving to Mexico. I think if he wants to be re-elected, he's going to stop that from happening. And he's going to have to make it more competitive to manufacture in the US. That's going to be a serious challenge.
He's already tweeted about that, actually.
Yes, and I think US-China relations are going to change, and he has threatened a 35% tariff. So it's going to be so challenging for China to do business with the US because he was saying that it's too easy for China to do business with us. We must raise the trade tariffs. So I think US-China and US-Mexico relations are going to change. Yes.
Now, just finally, to wrap this up,
okay,
what can we expect to see maybe in the first year of Trump's presidency? I know that might be a difficult one considering he just tweets everything and then we know what's going on. But in general, what can we expect from his administration, considering the people that he's already chosen for the key positions, for example?
Okay. In the first year, I think he's going to sort of have, I'm seeing closer ties with Russia. I think in the first year, they might even have some trade agreements that I know they are shocking, but with Russia, he might have some trade agreements with Russia because his Secretary of State, nominee, actually received the Medal of Friendship from Putin. So I think he's going to have some trade agreements with Russia, and is going to put in place a system to replace and repeal Obamacare.
Well, Tinashe, we'll have to leave it there. This time around, we are really done. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.